Russia's warning of confrontation with the U.S. and NATO over the Western alliance's expansion toward its borders. Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov says that Washington and NATO should offer security guarantees to ward off conflict. Last week, Russian President Vladimir Putin said that Moscow wants legally binding guarantees that the Western alliance would not further expand eastward. Putin also said that NATO should avoid deployment of weapon systems in close vicinity to Russian territory. And that's amid tensions over Russia's troop buildup near borders with Ukraine. The group of 7 major economies has accused Russia of planning an invasion. It's warned Moscow of consequences. Russia has rejected any such plan. It says the move is defensive as NATO pushed to get Ukraine into the alliance. Let's now get some insight on this story. So joining me will be Fred Ware, journalist and political commentator from Moscow. Also, Marcus Papadopoulos, historian and political analyst and author, is joining us from London. Good to see you, gentlemen. So, Fred, the saber rattling is going on. Moscow is saying you are getting too close to my borders, and NATO is saying otherwise, that you are planning an invasion. And there is this security guarantee that now Moscow is asking for. Would that be possible?
It's hard to say. This is not a new crisis. This has been going on for many years. It is the case that in 2009, Russia submitted a draft treaty to Europeans and NATO, which contained all these provisions that they want. What they want basically is an end to NATO expansion to the east. They've had enough of it. In the past 20 years or so, every single former Soviet Warsaw Pact ally has joined NATO. 3 former Soviet republics have. The front line, so-called front line of the Cold War, has moved 1,000 kilometers to the east. The Russians are, if you take into account their history and their mentality, are pretty worried about that. They want an end to it. And the place where they've chosen to make a stand on this is Ukraine, because Ukraine has a government that's keen to join NATO, it's very anti-Russian. So this is not new. Why did Russia decide to make a stand now? It's hard to say. There might be all kinds of different reasons, many of which we may not know. But one probably is that American debacle in Afghanistan. It showed just how strategically incoherent they are in Washington, how they don't know what they're doing often when they create these situations. And the government in Ukraine, although it's very much a Ukrainian situation, it is allied to the West. It is dependent and beholden to the West. Putin has decided to do this now. I do not believe the Russians have any intention of invading Ukraine, but they could cause a lot of trouble. It's a very divided country. The seat upon which President Zelensky sits is very unstable. So hard to say what they mean, but they have submitted draft proposals. We don't know exactly what they are now, but Putin said last week, our draft document is in the mail, pretty much, to Joe Biden. And they do expect Joe Biden to follow up on his promise last week to create a venue, maybe 4 or 5 NATO members and Russia, to sit down and talk seriously about Russia's security concerns.
Right. Let me turn to London. Marcus, as you've been watching in the past couple of weeks actually, the situation has been escalating instead of de-escalating, and even more saber rattling, and you can hear maybe drums of war. Hopefully not, but who do you hold responsible for this? Is it NATO, US, Moscow?
I'm of the opinion that the world could soon bear witness to a climax in the Ukraine crisis, a crisis which is in its nearly 8th year now, a crisis which was precipitated by America, Britain and the European Union when they engineered a coup in Kiev in February of 2014 against a democratically elected leader. And as a result of that coup, Ukraine was brought out of Russia's orbit and was brought into the West's sphere of influence. And the Americans and the British are intent on admitting Ukraine into NATO, which would result in Russia being completely encircled on its western border by NATO member states, from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. And it is very clear that Vladimir Putin has learnt from the horrendous mistake that Mikhail Gorbachev made in 1990, when the Soviet leader, in return for the Soviet Union consenting to German reunification, never asked the Americans, the British, and the French to put into writing that NATO would not expand eastwards beyond Germany's border. All that was given to Gorbachev, who was an incompetent fool, was an oral pledge that NATO would not expand eastwards. And let me make it very clear, the Americans, the British, the French, and the Germans assured orally Gorbachev that NATO would not expand. The American Secretary of State at the time, James Baker, said to Gorbachev, not 1 inch eastwards will NATO expand. Helmut Kohl, the then West German Chancellor, testified to that oral assurance given to Gorbachev, and so did the then French President, Francois Mitterrand. So Russia today is putting the ball, so to speak, in the court of NATO by saying, if you do not intend to admit Ukraine into the Western military bloc, then put this into writing. Now, of course, the Americans and the British, who are the de facto leaders of NATO, will not consent to that requirement of Moscow, because NATO is increasing its presence in Ukraine, in both soldiery and weaponry. And as a response, the Russians are building up their forces around Ukraine. Because in my recent book, I describe Ukraine as the soft underbelly of Russia. And make no mistake about it, NATO has very sinister plans in regard to Russia. And the Kremlin, like most other governments in the world, is conscious that NATO is a criminal and expansionist military bloc. They demonstrated their criminality in 1999 when they broke their own constitution, when they bombed the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. They broke their own constitution because the NATO constitution clearly stipulates that NATO will never use force to resolve a dispute. So the Kremlin looks at NATO on its borders, increasing its presence in Ukraine as a hostile move. And in the event that Ukraine becomes a member of the Western military bloc, NATO tactical aircraft operating from eastern Ukraine could reach Moscow in 12 to 15 minutes. That is simply an intolerable situation for Russia.
Right.
And I have made it very clear before on Press TV that Russia, if circumstances compel it to, will go to war over Ukraine. Ukraine will never be allowed to join NATO, because a Ukraine in NATO would pose a tremendous threat to Russian national security.
Okay.
Russian naval supremacy in the Black Sea would come to an end, and Russia would be dangerously encircled on its western border.
All right, appreciate your thorough comments. Fred Ware, journalist and political commentator in Moscow. Marcus Papadopoulos, historian, political analyst, and author in London. They joined us with their contribution. And thank you for watching this edition of the News Review.